Welcome to today's Getting Started with Codex session. I'm Derek.
And I'm Charlie.
And we work with customers to help them get onboarded to Codex. It's a really exciting time in the AI coding space, and it's quickly changing how developers work. So Codex is OpenAI's coding agent that developers can use across different surfaces, and we've seen firsthand how developers are delegating routine and time-consuming tasks to Codex and spending more time on complex and novel challenges like design and architecture. And we've seen a lot of excitement from the developer community about Codex, and our goal this session today is to give you a high-level introduction to Codex.
So we're going to cover a few different topics here. First, we're going to walk through just the introduction to Codex, what it is, kind of what the extent of the product is. Then we'll talk about installation and setup, how to get started with Codex. We'll then dive into agents.md, a README format for Codex, and how to configure Codex with config.toml. We'll also talk about prompting with Codex and some of the best practices around that. We'll give you some CLI and IDE tips and tricks, talk about MCP configuration, and then dive into advanced use cases and give you some follow-up additional resources.
So you can use Codex in multiple clients today. So the CLI allows for lightweight interaction in the terminal. It also offers a headless SDK mode for more advanced programmability. So Codex's IDE extension works with any VS Code-based IDE and really allows developers to write code in more of a rich graphical user interface. And you can also kick off remote tasks in a cloud environment as needed. And with Codex's cloud environments, it really allows you to run multiple parallel tasks in the background, even with your laptop closed. So it's really ideal for kicking off async tasks like code review or working while on the go with your mobile phone. So for today's session, we'll focus more on the CLI and the IDE extension.
So here are a few of the ways that customers are using Codex today and how it can integrate with your team's workflows. As Derek mentioned, you can kick off code reviews in Codex Cloud whenever a PR gets opened, and Codex can provide comments and find critical bugs and issues before they get merged into production. You can also use it with Slack mentions, so you can integrate Codex into Slack, mention it, and then it picks up the whole conversation thread that you've maybe been chatting with your team about, and then implements it and gives you a PR. And you can also build your own integrations with the Codex SDK. This allows you to run Codex programmatically in your own containers, and so you can get structured output out of Codex, and we'll cover this kind of in the back half of the presentation here.
So OpenAI at its core is a research company, and Codex is backed by our state-of-the-art models, most recently GPT 5.1 Codex Max, which is our best model for agentic coding. So it's specifically trained in the Codex CLI harness, and our continuous focus will be to have each model generation be more efficient, be able to run faster and longer, and to generate even better production-ready code. So our models are natively trained in Linux, macOS, Windows environments, so it'll be very reliable in Bash and PowerShell and will adhere to the sandboxing rules. We also train the model to be able to accurately auto-compact long conversations, so you can have Codex work for you on longer running tasks. So for example, really large-scale refactor tasks.
Yeah, Windows support and those long-running tasks are like maybe the two of the biggest feature requests we've been getting with Codex.
Definitely.
And we also recently published a guide that tells your team how to build an AI native engineering team. It goes through how we can use coding agents to accelerate different parts of the software development lifecycle. We broke it down into 7 phases that span planning and design all the way to documentation and maintenance. And as we go through today's session, I would just encourage you to think about how Codex can help your team in these different areas. Even though we're starting with just the basics here, all of this is applicable throughout the software development lifecycle.
So let's get started. As a quick reminder again, the focus of today's session is the CLI and the IDE surfaces. We'll be using an open source repository. So if you're new to Codex, we definitely encourage you to follow along using the same repository or just a repository of your choice. So let's dive right in. So how do we get started? Let's start with installing Codex CLI on your local machine. So you can install in a couple ways. You can install using brew or npm, which is the suggested method since it's going to be the most up-to-date. Our team ships very, very quickly, sometimes multiple times per week. So this way you're always going to be on top of the latest release. When you run Codex sessions as well, there's going to be a banner on the top that reminds you if there's a newer version to update to. If you want, you can look at the latest binary releases on GitHub, since Codex is open source. Codex CLI is open source. And you can also look at the change log on our developers website for more specific changes for each version. So you can install the Codex CLI extension in VS Code as well. And so to do that, you can open VS Code and click on the extensions tab here and search OpenAI Codex. And so you want to make sure you're looking at the official one made by OpenAI as seen here. And when you download it, you'll see the version that you have, and you'll be able to switch between pre-release version and the release candidate. And you can also toggle on auto update or not. I definitely recommend toggling on auto update since you want to make sure you're seeing the latest updates for the IDE extension. So let's talk about actually signing in with your ChatGPT Enterprise account to use Codex. So there's two different ways, and if you use either way, you'll be signed in on both sides. So on the IDE extension, when you first open it, you'll be able to see a splash screen that says sign in. And so when you click on that, it'll bring you to a sign-in page similar to how you'll see on the Codex CLI, which I'll demonstrate now. So in the Codex CLI, all you need to do is type Codex login, which will take you to a page where you can sign in with your work email. It will probably route you through your internal SSO to be able to log in. And once you've done with that, you'll be able to start using Codex locally on your computer on the CLI and the IDE extension. So let me go back here. And so once you're in Codex CLI, I'll show you how to start running it in a second. You'll see that there's a couple slash commands that I'll note throughout this session. The first one is /status. This just gives you a high-level overview of the model that you're using, the directory, the sandbox mode, the approval policy, how much context window you have left. So for example, just to go back to the CLI here, I'm on this specific version. I'm using this model and currently in the agents.md directory. And so what you can do is go to /status, and you'll see here that I'm using this specific set of configurations with my account and my session ID as well. And so let's get started by cloning the repository that we'll be using here today. So we're using the agents.md website, which you'll see here. So Charlie will talk more about agents.md and why it's very important. But for today, we'll be cloning this repository that's open source. So once you clone that repository through this link below, just cd into that file, install npm, and then npm run dev. So you'll be able to run it locally. And I will do the same here as well, npm run dev.
It's kind of meta. We're using the agents.md microsite while also talking about agents.md. And
exactly.
But, you know,
we want to hammer in agents.md today.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we've set up agents.md, and I'm running it locally now. So I'll hand it over to Charlie to dig a little deeper on agents.md.
Great. All right. So we have a project set up, and we want to work on it. We can use agents.md to help get Codex clued in to how this project is going to work. Why do we need an agents.md? Well, when you think about it, coding agents don't really retain any context between sessions. Every time you start it up, it's coming in with a fresh context window. Agents.md ensures that the instructions that you want to give the agent to just give it the background, the TLDR on your project, are always loaded automatically. Codex will always load this file in if it's in the directory where you're starting Codex. You can use it basically as a lightweight README that allows your agent to quickly understand and get up to speed on your project and just get that context it needs to actually be able to do its work. So there are a few different ways that you can use agents.md. You can create it with a /init command in the Codex CLI, and this will auto-generate a agents.md file for you just in the directory where you're working. You can also create an agents.md file in your Codex home folder, which is a global agents.md. This is good for just kind of global configs that you always want Codex to adhere to. things like using specific tools that are, just things that you use, or different kind of ways you want the agent to act. You can also create different agents.md files within your project and even subdirectories within your project. And these are really good for giving repo-specific context. Usually we'll put one at the git root of the project that is the starter place for Codex, because that's where we typically start up Codex. We might also include it in subdirectories for different services that just tell Codex as it goes into that directory, okay, here's what you're actually working on here. Here's the context that you need to pay attention to. All right, so what's included in an agents.md? Common sections that we often have in here are the project overview and the structure, just giving Codex pointers on where to go for different files. Also, how to build the project and running test commands, doing helpful CLI tools that you might use for yourself, like the GitHub CLI, for example, or different MCP servers that you want to integrate, and also giving Codex a workflow, just talking about how to go about implementing a feature from front to back. Lastly, you can include pointers to other task-specific guidance in different files for the agent, so that the agent can do progressive discovery as it wants to find out more about how to do things in your project. So some of the best practices that we recommend here. The first is to keep it brief and focused. If you include too many instructions, it can confuse the coding agent, and it won't know exactly what to pay attention to, or if they're conflicting, it can spend a lot of time figuring out how to resolve the conflicts. Most of OpenAI's agents.md files, and we looked in the monorepo to figure this out, were less than 100 lines, so they really don't need to be that long. The second recommendation is to focus on unlocking agentic loops. So anytime you can give the agent feedback or a way to get feedback from tools like linters, tests, etc., and verify its work, it really accelerates how much the agent can do. And a good kind of intuition to build here is, after you run Codex, if you're finding that you run commands to say check did the code compile, or maybe grab screenshots or something like that, see if you can add those as different commands and instructions for Codex and have it just do that itself and unlock those loops. Next, we recommend continually updating the agents.md file as Codex encounters mistakes that maybe it makes or kind of gotchas. So if you're watching Codex do a rollout and you see it took a really long time to derive the specific command it needed to run your test suite, for example, just add that command into your agents.md next time and watch how Codex will pull that into its context and then run a lot faster. And then you can also point it to task-specific files, and we'll talk about this in the next section, but basically reference other .md files from the main agents.md file. So just to look at an example of this, pointing Codex to task-specific docs, you can use agents.md to tell Codex where else to look. Agents.md is always loaded into context, so it has to be kind of general. And what you can do is just add a section here that says task-specific documentation, and then call out different task-specific documents that are located in your repository. For example, we might have an execplans.md file for planning large tasks. We might have a frontend.md file that's specific for doing front-end tasks. We might have an architecture.md file that outlines specific architectural judgment calls that you need to make when you're doing a feature that requires large architectural changes. Codex will read this in the agents.md, understand that it can call on these things in its context, and then if it needs to, it'll go and read the file and read it into its context, which allows it, again, to do progressive discovery on these things and kind of gear up to the different challenges you're giving it. So here's an example of providing a planning template with plans.md. You can use agents.md to point Codex to a plans.md file, and this is basically a template that tells the agent how to build out a plan for larger multi-step kind of projects that we want to take on. Codex will generate a markdown file using this exec plan as a template, and it can update this individual plan as a living document. So it'll go through and actually check things off a checklist and kind of update its progress here. And this helps Codex really run large refactors, do large kind of cross code-based sweeps, or work on multi-hour project tasks just more effectively by having a place where it can track how it executes and update as it progresses. I'll note you can also use MCP servers for this, but there's nothing like just having a markdown file for the model to read and having it checked into Git. It just makes it easy for the model to keep that context up to date. And you can see an example of using plans.md on the OpenAI cookbook, which I've linked to here as well.
Agents.md is really a cheat sheet at the end of the day. And the example Charlie just mentioned with plans.md, one of our engineers was able to run a 10+ hour refactor with Codex, and it was successful in the end. So this is a great example of what you can use Codex for today.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about how to further customize Codex to the way you work in addition to agents.md, which is the configuration.toml file. So Codex CLI was written in Rust, hence why it's in a TOML file. As you can see here on the right, there's a couple different areas that you can customize and have it run as default when you start a Codex session. For example, you can specify the default model reasoning effort, sandbox mode, approval policy, which I'll talk about in the subsequent slide. You can also toggle certain features to be default on, for example, web search. You can also specify different profiles. So for example, sometimes I just want to start a Codex session that defaults to the fastest model with the lowest reasoning effort to get the fastest responses. So I created a profile called fast. So I can just do codex-p space fast, and it'll create that specific configuration for the session. And as Charlie mentioned, MCP is an area that you can also configure Codex to work with. So in this example, we have one of the MCPs that we'll cover later in the session as an example on the right. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. As you can see on this slide here, there's a lot of different configurations that you can do with the Codex CLI. And if you go to this website, you will see a lot of different configurations for you.
One of my favorites to set here is the terminal notifications. It allows you to get like a pop-up when Codex finishes a task, which some people don't like. I actually like it because Codex will run in the background and like ring a bell when it's done for me, so that's nice. But
a lot of bells going off.
To
go back to the last slide here, so approval policy and sandbox mode are two areas I just want to dive a little further into. The default for Codex is to have the approval mode on request, which is Codex will run until it decides it needs to ask you for any escalated permissions. The other default is workspace write as the sandbox mode. What that does is Codex will write to files in your current directory and not anything outside. But as you can see here, there's a couple configurations that you can change with the default when you start a Codex session. Awesome. Let's turn it back over to Charlie to talk about prompting with Codex.
All right, so similar to writing an agents.md file, your prompt is kind of the ultimate context which you want to give Codex, right? And so writing a good prompt really determines kind of what you get out of Codex. There are a few tips here which we found to be kind of universally helpful. So the first is to use @mention to just point Codex to a file within your code base that you want to start focusing on. I use this a lot, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the file that you end up wanting to analyze or kind of like pull in, but a starting point to kind of anchor Codex where it can start then traversing all the code paths is really helpful. When we see the agent kind of go off the rails, a lot of times it's because it starts looking in a part of the code base where it's just not really relevant to what you're trying to do. So if you can anchor it with this, super helpful. The next recommendation is to start with small tasks before you move on to larger ones. So if you're new to prompting with a tool like Codex, smaller tasks are going to be easier for you to test out and kind of review to start. And as you get more comfortable, ramp up asking Codex to do kind of more and more tasks and larger units of work. But as a tip here, you can actually use Codex to help break tasks down, and it can do this by looking at your code base. So if you ask it to do kind of just a pure research effort to go look through your code base and figure out how it would implement a feature and break it into small tasks, it'll actually come up with very small units of work that you can then just prompt it to do and follow up on and follow along with. We always recommend including verification steps, so provide Codex with the steps to check its work, for example, running tests, linters, etc. If this isn't in your agents.md, it's good to include in your prompt. Another way to do this is just tell Codex, here are the requirements that you need to implement in order for this feature to be considered complete. And it can use that as kind of a yardstick to measure its progress as it works along. The next is, if you're debugging, which is one of the top use cases of Codex, just paste the full stack trace into Codex, give Codex the full kind of detail there, and it can use that to navigate your code base and figure out what's generating the error. Super, super helpful. As we mentioned before, you can customize how Codex does its work by using agents.md. And we also recommend that you try open-ended prompts. This can be great to just brainstorm ideas for feature improvements or how to improve performance. You can ask Codex kind of after you implement a feature, what would you consider building next? And Codex is actually really good at kind of looking at your code base and holistically considering, okay, here's what I would add. So there's more on the developer's website on this, and we encourage you to check out the prompting guide for Codex as well.
A great thing Codex does as well is Codex CLI actually gives you next steps, suggested next steps when you ask it a prompt. So this is a great way for you to continue the brainstorm conversation, as you said.
Yeah. So some great starter tasks, if you were to just try Codex today, explain the code base. Just write a quick README based on something that you're interested in the code base, or maybe another team's code base at your company. Use it for bug fixing. Just paste in the stack trace and have it work on fixing a bug for you. Have it expand test coverage. So take a look at a feature and ask it, which edge cases do we need to consider? Are there other things that we need to add in here to complete our test coverage? And it can build out those tests for you. And then also doing refactors across many files. So maybe we want to make a generic component that's kind of spread across multiple different implementations. Codex can look through and identify patterns, extract that component, and then make it kind of generic across all those different interfaces. It's really good at those kind of refactoring tasks.
And one underrated area is writing documentation.
Yeah.
Engineers typically don't like doing that, so I love using Codex CLI to help me write the documentation that's needed.
Keeps it up to date as you're building things. So let's take a look at this in the CLI of how you can send a read-only prompt and change the reasoning effort with Codex. If you're in the CLI, you can fire it up using Codex and then use /models to switch between low, medium, and high. Let me pull this up and show you what this looks like in VS Code. So I'm in VS Code, and I'm just going to pull open Codex in the side panel here. I have a few options down at the bottom. I can go and select if I want to work locally, which we're going to focus on today. But you can also actually run tasks in the cloud. So if you've connected Codex Cloud, you can have your agents spin up a cloud container, run multiple different iterations in parallel in those containers, and it's a great way to get different versions going. We can also switch the different modes that Codex has access to here. So for this, I'm just going to ask it about the code base. I'll put it into chat mode, but I can also put it into agent mode or agent full access mode or a custom configuration mode here. And then lastly, I can pick the different reasoning models, the different models here, and also the reasoning level that I want Codex to use. This will be a pretty simple question. I'll just say, can you tell me about this project? You can make this more custom, and it'll go through. It will actually research kind of what's going on in the project. You can see it's starting its chain of thought here. And once it gets going, working with this, we can see the steps that it's following. So it'll give us a summary of what it's trying. You can actually check out kind of the files that it's read down here. And when it's done, it'll produce a full summary for us to actually go and review here. One of the things that I love that's kind of a more advanced way of using this is actually asking it to look through the Git history. And it can use Git just like it would on the command line to figure out maybe who committed to this file or what were the recent changes that happened in the project. Super helpful way to get on board.
Codex is a know-it-all historian.
Yeah. So that's sending like a read-only prompt, but obviously we also want to be able to make changes. So here's an example that I've already kind of pre-built here. I wanted to create a simple HTML page called assets.html that shows how the files in this agents.md project are related. So we could generate a markdown file, or we could generate a whole documentation website. So let's generate a documentation website. Just to show how I did this, if I go back here and actually view the different prompts that I have, I can see the different conversations that I have going here. And if I go into this one, here's where we created the simple HTML site. I can see that it created this assets.html file for me. I can click to open that in the side panel. And I can also go and see kind of the summary of the chain of thought. So Codex went and actually implemented this as a file here. If I pull it up here and grab it, it's in assets.html.
You can just go to Chrome and show it.
And if we pull it open in Chrome here, I can tab over to... if I tab over to Chrome here, let me get this going again here. Is it in...
It's right here.
Oh, there we go. If I tab over to Chrome here, I can pull this open, and we have this file that's already kind of generated a really nice looking like documentation page for us here, where it's calling out kind of the different flows in the project, where all the different files do. Again, super simple example, but just kind of a quick run through of what Codex can generate really quickly for you. All right. So let's go back into the presentation here real quick. And there we go. So we can also send a prompt that makes further changes to the site. So not just kind of like documenting things, but like changing existing functionality. So that for this one, I can say, can you implement, next to the Explore Examples, View on GitHub buttons, and maybe a download button, and another one to copy the page's markdown. So all I need to do this is open up a new conversation here. I'll just start a new chat and say, can you implement some hero buttons to download the repo, link to GitHub, and copy the markdown of the site. Let's kick that off there, and I'm actually going to pause this real quick. I'm going to switch it over into agent mode so that it can go and implement this for me, and then let me run this again here. So this will kick off Codex, and it will actually go and work on implementing these new buttons for us. It looks like it's exploring the files. It's reading kind of our hero file to figure out where we want to put that in there. One of the nice things about the IDE, it gives you these pills that kind of allow you to click and open up the file that Codex is referencing so you can follow along with it. It's come up with a planning task list here that kind of shows us how it's going to think through the different steps that it wants to work on. And then when it's done, it'll actually have added these buttons to the site for us. So it'll just go through there a little bit and kind of figure out exactly what it wants to add. Yeah. Okay, so we just wrapped up the task there, and then if we go over to check out agents.md in the browser now, you can see it's added a few different buttons here where we can download the repo, we can view it on GitHub, we can copy the markdown, etc. And Codex has just implemented that for us based off of a simple prompt there. So pretty cool how quickly we can just implement things with that. All right. Over to you for some more CLI IDE tips and tricks.
Thanks, Charlie. Let's talk about some different tips and tricks across this two surfaces, the CLI and the IDE. So Charlie already mentioned this briefly earlier, but you can point Codex to specific files in your code base. For example, in the CLI, I can quickly just mention any sort of file. So I can specify file and ask any questions so Codex knows exactly where to look at. Also within the IDE extension, I can also do the same. I can pick a specific file. One thing to note here as well is you can actually bind specific keyboard shortcuts to specific functionality. So here there's one that you can actually bind and add context by just highlighting specific parts of the text in a file. So I bind a Command-Shift-C personally, and as you can see here, I added context for the hero TSX file, these specific 10 lines by just binding the hotkey there. So just another tip in terms of what you can do with the Codex in the CLI and the IDE extension. So you can also use to-dos in Codex IDE, and this is a feature that I personally love using. So for example, if I go back to this IDE extension, I can actually go to a specific part of the file. In this case, I believe I have a to-do already here that asks Codex to do something similar to what Charlie did, which is to implement a button to download Markdown to view on GitHub. And once you have that to-do created, you can actually just click on implement with Codex, and it'll actually fire off a task on the right here. I won't have it fully run since we've already completed this task, but as you can see here, you can technically have a lot of different to-dos within your code and actually just have Codex implement all of them for you, which is fantastic. So let me go back to the slides here. So another area that a lot of people use Codex for is to actually prompt Codex with an image example. So in this case, if I go to the agents.md file, you see here there's no background color for these three setup commands. What I can do is actually just take a screenshot of it and ask Codex to make the inline background code chips orange. So in this case, maybe I'll just use the CLI here since we've already used the IDE for a couple examples. In this case, I'll just paste in the screenshot here. Can you make the inline chips orange? Great. So Codex is able to read that. As you can see, it'll explore the code base and find exactly where it needs to update. In a few seconds here, it'll be able to actually change the background colors of those 3 setup commands to be orange.
Super helpful. Like anytime you find yourself trying to describe like which button third from the left or whatever, like Codex is supposed to modify.
Exactly.
Or like, you just give it an image that's able to understand the image and make code changes based off of
As
that.
you can see here, it added a couple lines, took out a line here. So if I actually go back, great, it was able to implement according to what I asked it to do, which is fantastic. So you can also do this in the IDE. Just to quickly show how that would work, you would just click on the plus and add image. As you can see here, I can specify the screenshot.png that I have on my desktop and do the exact same thing on the IDE extension. All right, so one other great tip is to know how to resume a Codex session. So within the CLI, when you quit a session, typically people want to sometimes go back to the session to continue the conversation, especially when there's still a huge amount of context remaining. So one thing you can do is in the Codex CLI interface is just run Codex resume. And so what this will do is come back with all the previous conversations that you had with Codex, and you can actually just go specifically back to a conversation. In this case, I went back to this specific conversation, and I can just continue it. So this is just an example where, for example, I can just ask Codex to change the chip code to green after I change it to orange. So again, this is a very, very simple example of how you can resume conversations. And as you can see within Codex CLI, there is a session ID. So if you want to go back to a very specific session and not have to scroll through the Codex resume UI, you can just run the specific command and it'll go back to that session. And Charlie already showed this earlier, but you can always go back within the IDE and search for a specific task and show that accordingly and continue the conversation.
Yeah, as you can tell, context management is just so important to getting the right results out of there, and that session contains all of the context that you've given the model. So I use it a lot as kind of like, just almost like a mini project container for a specific aspect of a project that I'm working on. Maybe like I have a test session that I'm kind of working on, or I have like a specific session for implementing a front-end feature or something like that. Yeah, definitely
very, very helpful. Another great tip is you can actually use Codex in the IDE extension to generate Mermaid sequence diagrams. So this will show you how the processes operate with one another and in what order in the repo. So to show this in the IDE extension, I can go back, sorry, too many windows, and actually show you that I ran this earlier. So all I asked is provide me a clean Mermaid sequence diagram for this code base, and it came back with a very concise sequence diagram that I can copy, I can download, and this is really great for complex repos. Awesome. So one other area that we briefly touched on earlier is web search is default to be off for Codex. And so what you can do in the config.toml file is to have the web search request default to be true. If you don't have that in your config.toml, you can also just pass in a configuration flag. So in this case, you can just ask Codex with enable web search requests to add something like the latest news footer box that gives you the current article of the Next.js 15. And so this is just a quick example of how you can pass in specific configurations when you start a Codex session. And one great area that a lot of our users use Codex for is to add specific custom commands. So in this case, you can go to your Codex home folder and create a prompts folder and add test.md file as an example. So what this file will do is ask Codex to generate unit tests for any of the files that changed and use the existing test runner and just to keep the diffs minimal. So what you can do, and let me demonstrate very quickly, is you can go to your Codex home folder. In this case, I just opened it within VS Code, and you can create, like I mentioned, a prompts folder, and in here I added an @test.md file. And so what that does is if I go back to Codex CLI, if you just added it, you should quit and just restart it. What you see is that if you type in prompts, you actually see the @test.md file here. So when you click enter, it'll actually pull in the exact instructions that you gave this markdown file and actually generate the unit test for any of the files that changed. So very, very convenient, and obviously this is just one example of a custom command that you can add for Codex. So let's move on to MCP. So MCP, as most people know here, it's really a protocol for connecting models to any sort of additional tools and context. So with Codex, we support standard I/O and also HTTP transport. And so here are just a couple examples of common MCP servers that a lot of our customers use. For example, people connect the Figma MCP server, so they can generate any sort of front-end designs based on mockups there. The Jira and linear MCPs are both very popular. So for example, you can see what tickets are assigned to you. You can have Codex actually create the code changes for you and update the ticket to done, for example. You can also use, for example, Context7 to implement any third-party API callouts. And also the Datadog MCP server is hugely popular to diagnose any production issues as well. But as you know, there's a lot of different MCP servers out there, and Codex is able to connect to these servers for additional context. So here's just one example. We called it a cupcake MCP. This is a very simple example that we created just for this session. So what this does is just returns an example of how many cupcakes someone has ordered. Just a very simple example here. And to run that command and to add the MCP to Codex, what I'll do here, as you can see here, this is the generating unit tests that I did earlier. In this case, I'll just quit and start it again. And I copied in this command to add this cupcake MCP server. So with Codex, we made it very simple for you to just type in Codex MCP add and add in the parameters. And when I click enter, it added a global MCP server called cupcake MCP. And to show that it actually did add, if I go back to the config.toml file, as you can see here, if I reduce the size of this, it did add the MCP server here. So you can also just directly add it in your config.toml, but we've seen a lot of our users just use the simple Codex MCP add as an example. So to use one example on how to use the cupcake MCP, so we are going to ask Codex to add a section at the bottom of the agents.md page that just fetches Rachel's cupcake order. And very simple. I'll just use this to illustrate how MCP connections work within Codex. And so I'm starting another Codex session here, and I'm going to paste in this request. And so as you'll see in a second, it'll be able to call the Codex cupcake MCP server and actually add this piece of code at the bottom of the agents.md page.
Cool. I'm waiting for it to pop up. It's gonna call it.
Yeah. It'll come in a few seconds here. It's analyzing the integration options for Rachel's order. It's serious business here. It's searching for cupcake, and there we go. It called cupcake MCP search. It was able to fetch her order. As you can see here, Rachel ordered 7 marble cupcakes for pickup. I'm getting hungry just looking at this. And what it'll do, Codex will add this to the bottom of the agents.md file.
So pretty simple, but you can see how you could extend this to, for example, like production logs.
Definitely.
Maybe you want to pull down to diagnose a performance issue, or like grab like a Jira ticket and like pull in the context from that ticket for Codex to work on. So again, super basic example to start, but I think like indicates, how much you can actually do with MCP.
Exactly. I will move on to the next example as it completes this task. So one other MCP I just want to mention that is hugely popular is Context7, where it can pull in the most up-to-date documentation for any framework out there. So what you can also do is use a similar Codex MCP add command to add Context7 as an MCP server in your config. So in this case, I did already add Context7. So you can see here, I already have Context7 present in my config.toml file. And so the next example, I will use this, but I do see that the cupcake example was finished. And so let me actually go back to the file here, the agents.md file running locally on my computer, and I'll reload it. And it should be able to show me the cupcakes example at the bottom. Let me scroll to the bottom here. There we go.
There you go.
It looks like,
Nice job.
yes, indeed, Rachel has 7 marble cupcakes ready for pickup. So I know what I'll be doing after this session. All right, so let's move on to this example, which is using Context7. So this example, I'm going to ask Codex to implement an input on the agents.md page running locally where people can actually generate their own agents.md file using a small prompt that actually calls OpenAI's responses API. And it'll actually take the latest docs from Context7 to get the latest API spec. And so let me copy this prompt and let's go with the IDE extension for this example. And so I'm going to keep it on agent. Maybe in this case, I'll use a different model. I'll use GPT-5.1 Codex Mini. I'll use Medium, and I'll ask it to implement this input for me. So what you'll see in a second, it's able to call the Context7 MCP and actually add this change to the agents.md page. So as you can see here, it's able to retrieve Context7's library docs. It's able to now explore different files. It's reading our agents.md that's present in our repository, and looks like it's preparing to add the agents.md generator. So very quickly, it's able to understand what my request is, look at the docs, and actually read through the different files within this repository.
And this is super helpful, right? Because models have so much pre-training context, but it kind of has like a knowledge cutoff date. And so like as programming frameworks evolve and documentation gets updated, things like Context7 or really any MCP that you want to integrate, a lot of customers build their own internal documentation MCPs. Just helps Codex stay in sync with actual implementation that, as it updates in real time.
Definitely, definitely. Awesome. See, it's continuing to work. In this case, I will go back to the slides and talk about the next tip that I have, which is actually to add more custom instructions to your global agents.md that sits in your Codex home folder that Charlie mentioned earlier. So in this case, if you don't want to have to ask Codex to look at Context7 every time, you can actually add a specific input within the Codex home folder, which I'll show you here, which is to actually say, when implementing new features of any external libraries or APIs, always search if there's relevant documentation on Context7. As you can see, I have a couple other lines on my personal Codex home agents.md file. But what this will do is actually allow the user to not even specify Context7, and Codex will be able to read your global agents.md and actually call the exact same MCP server without you specifying it, which is fantastic. So I believe perfect timing. It looks like it's about to be done with all 3. It looks like it was able to change 3 files. It added almost 300 lines of code. As Charlie mentioned, you can also look at the specific diff as well. Looks like it's doing serious business here, looking through some of the files. All right, let's go back to this this last tip that I have before this prompt finishes, which is actually to use Codex to review your code for you. So there's a couple ways to do that within the CLI and the IDE. Within the CLI, there's 4 options. You can have Codex review against a specific base branch. You can have Codex review all your uncommitted code locally. You can also have Codex review specific commit. And you can also provide custom review instructions on top. As Charlie mentioned earlier when we were talking about agents.md, you can actually have a specific separate MD file that's not directly in agents.md. So for example, what I've seen a lot of users do is create a code review guidelines.md that's referred to within the agents.md file to not overflow the agents.md file with too many lines. So this is one great way to steer Codex to understand how to actually review your specific team's code. And within the IDE, there's also the ability to review code, as I'll show here in a second. There's slash commands here, so when you click on code review, you can also review it against a specific base branch or review your uncommitted changes. But before we do that, let's take a look at what Codex was able to do with adding this inputs. So let's go back to this file and see if it was able to add this responses API section. So great. Looks like it's able to add a section that will actually use OpenAI's responses API to generate an agents.md file with your prompt. So just a great way to do that. So I will quickly show how to fire off the code review. So again, you can use Codex CLI with the review command, so you can review your uncommitted changes, review a specific commit, or add custom review instructions. In this case, I'll quickly show how it works within the IDE extension. So I can click on code review here and click on review uncommitted changes, and it'll be able to actually run through, and it'll come back with a couple responses. Usually it'll look to see if there's any P0 or P1 issues, and it'll definitely surface that. It'll also surface sometimes P2 or P3 issues. And it's just a great way to know what you need to fix and actually ask Codex to fix it for you. Because it does come back with a button within the IDE extension where you can just click on it and it'll help you fix the issue, which is
pretty
fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah.
Exactly. What a great way to do everything in one with the Codex CLI and the IDE extension.
I think one of the most important things we found with code review is that it really can't be too noisy. Like if it's commenting on too much, people just tune it out. And so the model has actually been trained to kind of really only focus on those P0 or like P1 issues. And sometimes they'll find P2s or like P3s, but like I often find usually when it comments, it's like, if I don't fix this, it's going to break in production.
Exactly. It's definitely found some code issues internally that it helped fix. And it's just a great way to not have an expensive linter, right? Because it always comes back with something that is actually an issue that you can actually have Codex fix for you. Now let's hand it back over to Charlie to talk about some of the juicy advanced use cases.
Yeah, so one of the things that I get really excited about with Codex CLI is that you can use it obviously interactively, but you can also use it programmatically. So you can build it into different pipelines or build different use cases with it that kind of run on your own containers and just do really whatever you want to build. So to kind of show this, I wanted to jump into the terminal here and just pull up Codex and kind of show what this looks like. So in our agents.md site here, we have a special file that I've created. I'll actually show this over here, called Codex Output Schema. If I close Codex on the side here, we can see what this is. It's just a JSON file that adheres to the OpenAI structured output schema format. And this tells Codex precisely the format that we need to receive a response back in. So for this example, I was working on doing like a code style analysis kind of checker. And I have a few different properties. It has to include like the number of files that it analyzed, the total number of issues that it found, the overall score from 0 to 100. We can also define like an array so that we can have individual items for every single issue that it finds, and each of these can have their own required fields. It's a very extensible format. And what we can do is actually run Codex with this and do Codex exec, which is Codex's headless mode, analyze this app for code quality issues, and then give it this output schema param and just have it generate JSON. I'll fire this off here, and you can see, rather than going into an interactive terminal mode, Codex is just streaming kind of the raw logs out, which we can consume. But to kind of give you an example of what this looks like, we can see it already ran through this here, and when it's done, it prints out this valid JSON that we parsed with JQ. It gives you all of the total files, the total issues, the file citations, the line numbers, the severity of the issue, the description, all in a structured format. And we could do a ton of stuff with this. For example, if we want to make an API request for every single issue that it finds, or we want to save each one to a database, We can build this into an app. We can run it in our CI/CD pipeline. It's a very simple but powerful kind of primitive to be able to do a lot of programmatic work with Codex. So what can we use to actually build with this? You can do things like security triage. You can make a test coverage bot. You can do a refactor and cleanup automation. You can do a release hygiene automation that creates change logs and readmes every time you mint a new release. All these things are kind of things you can just build into the software development lifecycle here. And on top of that, we can actually get a bit more advanced. Instead of just doing a single-step workflow, we can build advanced multi-step workflows with the OpenAI Agents SDK and Codex. So OpenAI's Agents SDK helps us build agent handoffs and scope agent context and tooling to individual agents. And Codex can actually work as an MCP server within Agents SDK that basically makes it a tool that can be called by the agent. This is extremely powerful because we can use the Agents SDK to, say, create a front-end agent that's just focused on building front-end, or a PM agent that's just focused on doing project management, or a back-end engineer that just focuses on the back-end. Give them each their own MCP tools, their own context, and tell them to hand off to one another. And because we're using the Agents SDK, we automatically get traces, which you can see on the side here, that shows how Codex is called, or the different agents are handing off to each other before they call Codex, and the context that they gave Codex before they asked it to write some code. We have a whole example in the OpenAI cookbook, but we think this is a really neat way to build out some of these longer controlled rollouts that we want to do for big refactors or big feature work. The next one I'll call out is on-prem code review. So similar to what we saw with the example with parsing JSON, you can build your own code review, the same as what is built into GitHub with Codex Cloud, just running in your own containers. This can be super useful if you're on-prem or if you have another SCM that's not GitHub. You can just build this there. Uses Codex's unique code review capabilities. You can use the exact same prompt that we include in the CLI and Codex Cloud. And you can use structured outputs to flag the different issues that it finds and just run in your own pipeline. Similar to that, you can go beyond doing code review and actually auto-fix CI. So if tests fail when you push up something to your pull request, you can have Codex trigger based off of that, check out your branch, make a pull request back on top of that with a fix to make tests pass, and then just merge your PR from there and save a bunch of time that way. And then when we actually use on the Codex open source repo is triggering Codex whenever an issue gets created to auto-label the issue. This is pretty basic, but super, super helpful. Basically, we can use Codex to categorize the issues based off of a series of predefined labels. And this doesn't need to match any kind of like specific, text matching or anything like that. Codex can kind of understand the intent of the issue and use that to apply a label, which our team then uses to figure out how we're going to tackle the issue itself. So before we wrap up, I just want to share a few additional resources, some for all users. So for the Codex documentation, go to developers.openai.com/codex. Lots of great tips there and kind of full documentation available. We also have a series of Codex cookbooks, which are guides that we've put together based off of our own kind of experience onboarding customers and experience from our engineers internally at OpenAI. And then also the Codex changelog, which captures all of the different features that are being added to Codex. As we mentioned, we're shipping pretty rapidly, so that updates pretty frequently. If you're an admin, we have an enterprise admin guide for you, as well as a security guide, and then a rate card that captures the credits that are used by Codex so you can understand usage. And with that, that's it. Thanks for watching our presentation, and we hope you are able to use Codex and spin up on it well.
Thank you so much.